Good morning, everyone. I'm Erin Clark. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the Senior Director of SafeLine at the Safe Alliance in Austin, Texas. I've worked at Safe and on SafeLine for 29 years, and I've worked with so many amazing folks over the years to transform our domestic violence hotline into SafeLine, which is a program with phone, chat, and text advocacy services for survivors of sexual and domestic violence, child abuse, and human trafficking.
Okay, great. And can you see those slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm actually wanting to introduce another person who's on the call with us, which is Dr. Rachel Bothstrag, who's going to be helping me out in the chat, especially because I'm struggling with multiple screens. But Rachel, if you could just say hi real quick. Rachel is part of the second phase of this project. We're going to be talking about the first phase today, but she's going to pop in and say hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Bothstrag. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Arlington. I'm thrilled to be part of the expansion of this project and continuing this great work with and alongside survivors and agencies. So if you have questions and they get answered by me in the chat, that's who I am. Nice to see you all.
Okay, and Erin, you can see the slides, right?
I can.
Okay, I'm gonna try to, oh, well, okay, wait. All right, so today we want you to feel free to have your camera off or on, stretch, do whatever you need to do to kind of get through the content. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll also have time for questions at the end. I think we should still be good on time. We'll try to kind of make sure that we have that space. The other thing is Erin and I are super into talking with people over email or phone or whatever needs to be done, because we know all of your agencies are unique and have your own kind of like environmental situation. So if you just want a little bit more technical assistance, usually when we do these presentations, a lot of people's like individual questions will come up. So we have our emails at the end, and then we'll make sure that we have time for those Q&As at the end. So today what we want to do is talk about the use of chat and text hotline to help survivors of sexual violence and their support people, whether those are informal support people like friends and family or formal support people, like other counselors, substance use workers, different people in the community. So what we're going to do is talk about a project that we've been working on now. Erin, we're about to enter our 4th year, which is amazing. Evaluating chat and text services, starting at SafeLine in Austin, Texas, where both Erin and I are based. And we're going to be talking about our different experiences on this project. And really what we hope to do today is articulate a model of advocacy for chat and text support for survivors of sexual violence. So we've done this work looking at a broad range of violences, including dating, domestic violence, human trafficking, child maltreatment. Today's topic, because of the TASA conference and, kind of we've honed down today to talk a little bit more specifically about sexual violence. But as appropriate, we're going to expand that maybe to different facets of human trafficking or dating violence as it connects to sexual violence. So we want to talk about the evaluation project that we've been working on together, but we also want to create space to talk about how chat and text services are implemented. And then Erin in particular is going to provide a lot of really vital kind of just practical information about how SafeLine implemented chat and text, how they've selected platforms, how they recruit and train staff, really just kind of on the ground things. We're going to talk about some very specific skills. So that's a little bit of what we want to do today. And again, hoping that folks will chat in as needed. Just a little bit about our orientation to this project and to the Hotline Universe. So we really conceived of this project and our work on Hotline as a critical branch of advocacy services. So we know that phone hotline has been a cornerstone of our movement to end sexual violence since the very beginning of the movement. We were doing versions of crisis line, hotline, phone tree, providing that support. So we've used that technology in the movement since it began. what Hotline often gets talked about as a crisis intervention service, which it is, but it's also an advocacy service. It's also a community education service. So we really honor Hotline in this and its iteration into chat and text in this study. And really Hotline is, whether it's chat, text, phone, it is the critical access point to longer term services. So it has a really important role in our movement. And you can see that in the depth and breadth of hotline services available, both at the national level and the local level. Just a little bit of how we conceive of advocacy for this project. And this is just kind of a starting point for us for the sake of a PowerPoint. But when we talk about advocacy, sometimes people can talk about advocacy as case management or maybe as therapy services. And definitely case management and counseling might be part of advocacy. But when we're talking about advocacy for Hotline, we're talking about a survivor or a service user. If it's not a survivor, it's a support person, a service user centered, trauma informed, low barrier voluntary model that is aimed at empowerment and increasing resources for survivors. So that's how we conceive of advocacy and its unique role. One critical part of advocacy for this project and the work that we do together, Erin and I have gotten to work together on a couple different evaluations, is really perceiving advocacy not only as a micro interaction between two people or between people and groups, but also a macro intervention in that as advocates in the movement, we work with systems informally and formally to make them more survivor centered, to make them more trauma informed, to make them low barrier, to make them voluntary. And that work has never been as more critical than it is right now in our history. So really using our advocacy skills on both the individual and group level, but also across different systems to help survivors be able to direct their own services and have autonomy and be empowered after violence. Advocacy relies on a relationship that is built between people, and on Hotline, that relationship building happens really fast. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that happens. But that's how that we kind of approach this study and our work together. Erin?
Okay, thank you. SAFE is based in Austin, Texas, and we offer a variety of services on multiple campuses related to sexual assault and exploitation, dating and domestic violence, family violence, human trafficking, and child abuse and neglect. Our programs are based around housing, healing, prevention, and community support. And some, but not all, of the services we offer at SAFE include emergency shelter, counseling and peer support, transitional and rapid rehousing services, community resource advocacy, foster and adoption services, forensic nursing, and sexual assault advocacy at both our on-site clinic as well as local medical facilities. Legal services, support and case management for survivors of trafficking ages 20 through 22. Supervised visitation and exchange, disability services, life skills classes, parenting support, and violence prevention in elementary, middle, and high schools, as well as community education and training, and of course, SafeLine. Next slide. So SafeLine provides 24/7 confidential support through phone, text, and chat-based advocacy. Most of our advocates are English, Spanish bilingual, and we use telephonic interpretation that can serve clients in over 240 languages. SafeLine is the only bilingual hotline in Travis County for survivors of sexual and domestic violence, child abuse, and human trafficking and exploitation. From January 2021 through January 2022, we answered 19,588 hotline calls, 2,184 chats, and 858 texts. And so far in 2022, we are on track to answer more than 26,000 contacts for this year. Safeline has a staff of 27 advocates that are full-time, part-time, and PRN. We also have 2 managers, 1 director, and 1 senior director. Next slide, please. All right. So Safeline began looking into adding chat and text services prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen many agencies implementing chat and text both during and post-COVID. Chat and text are popular methods of communication among all age brackets and are the preferred methods of communication among youth and emerging adults. We have learned that they can also be preferred methods of communication for survivors who are deaf, as well as survivors that have safety concerns related to using the phone to speak about their needs. Integrating chat and text into our existing hotline services was about a 2 to 3 year process. We began in 2015 by identifying that we wanted to add chat and text services. We began applying for grant funding, and in late 2015, we reviewed and selected a chat platform. We received funding and hired and trained 2 staff that were dedicated only to doing chats. And then we began providing chat services with limited days and hours of availability. In 2017, we began text platform review and selection, and were able to begin offering text services in January 2018. As of 2022, our chat and text services are now available 24/7, and all of our advocates are trained in how to provide advocacy via phone, chat, and text. Next slide, please. When looking for chat and text platforms, we were guided by an excellent document that was provided by NNEDV, which is the National Network to End Domestic Violence. It's titled Digital Services Toolkit. This toolkit can be found at nnedv.org and includes the documents Assessing Capacity and Readiness for Digital Services, Choosing a Platform and Vendor, and Best Practices for Digital Services. So safety for users was our top consideration. And some questions that we asked of potential vendors were, what are your platform's data security and privacy policies? Does a potential user have to download an app, or can they just use it directly online? And how easily can message history be deleted by the service user? Of course, cost was also a consideration for us. We were unsure of the amount of chats that we would receive initially on a monthly basis, so we searched for a chat package that would charge us a flat rate for 100 chats per month and then charge us for each additional chat after that. We also looked for a company that would allow us to upgrade the package as needed when our chat volume increased over time. There are a great variety of chat packages that you can choose from, starting with just very basic chat provision and then increasing to packages that include the bells and whistles of TTY and relay services, the ability to accept photos and videos, or even have an unlimited number of seats for multiple advocates to respond to chats at the same time. Next slide, please. So the platforms that we decided to go with were Live Chat for chats and OneReach for texts. Ultimately, they provided us with the most affordable and flexible options. They had the safety measures that we were looking for, and they allowed us to tailor the platforms to meet our needs. For us, the must-haves included reliable IT support when needed, end-to-end encryption, that we had ownership of the chat and texts within the platforms, so that we could delete the transcripts at any time instead of having to wait for the platform to delete them on a monthly or quarterly basis. Also, we wanted the ability to create the welcome message that users see when they first log on, the ability to offer a post-chat survey to users, and the ability to restrict users from sending us photos and videos. By 2020, we had learned how challenging it was for advocates to navigate between two different platforms. So we combined chat and text into one platform through live chat. Currently, we pay about $118 a month for chat services and about $200 a month for text services and a dedicated phone number for text.
Erin, could you talk a little bit about why being able to delete those transcripts and kind of and have ownership on your side was so important?
Absolutely. So as we were reviewing different platforms, we learned that different companies had different policies around who actually owned the chats. And we found that with the companies who felt that they owned the chats and that we weren't the owners of the chat, they would have so much control over how long they were stored and things like that. And we have been walking the balance between wanting to store those archives for quality control and review with advocates, and also for the SafeLine study that you're going to talk about. But we also wanted to balance that with not having those chats and texts available out there in the universe, just as an additional measure of safety and protection for our clients. So we felt like a must-have was for us to have complete control and ownership over those archives. Okay, so here is an example of one of the documents that you can find at nnedv.org that guides you in selecting a digital service company. Again, these documents cover considerations specific to chat and text messaging when used to offer crisis services, and they can help you decide if you want or even need additional features, such as video calls, the ability to email clients, facilitate web chats for support groups, different things like that. As Dr. Wood mentioned earlier, my email will be provided at the end of this presentation. And I'd like to encourage you to reach out if you're considering adding chat and text services and have any questions. So at this time, I'll hand the presentation back to Dr. Wood, who will share with you details about the multi-year evaluation of digital advocacy services on SafeLine.
Thanks, Erin. And we're gonna, I'm gonna give some information about the evaluation, but don't worry, Erin's gonna she's gonna come back with her wisdoms. She's the star of this show here in terms of how this actually happens. So Erin and I have been working together for almost 4 years on evaluating SafeLine, especially the chat and text feature of SafeLine. And this was pre-COVID that we began this work, and SafeLine was one of the very few spots providing this kind of chat and text advocacy. So we applied to the National Institute of Justice for a grant to do an initial evaluation. And just basically our goal in our first phase of our study was to understand how advocacy, this core service model that's typically done either in person or over the phone, how advocacy is being implemented over chat and text, and who it's working for, where there's maybe some service barriers, who likes using it, who doesn't like using it as much, because in a survivor-centered model, you want to have as many options as possible for folks to reach out. So what we, as Erin mentioned, part of the reason SafeLine's chat and text services came to be is because they were hearing from clients, from younger folks, from folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, from people who are maybe native Spanish speakers, that they would prefer to reach out over chat and text. And then, of course, COVID happened in the middle of our study. So it just, everything kind of exploded from there. But what we really wanted to do was try to understand a little bit more about how advocates are implementing that service model and what folks think about it. So what we also aim to do with this study, and we'll share, I think Rachel's sharing some of these links in the chat and we'll share them at the end too, is we also wanted to create some practical documents for the field about how you would implement chat and text services. before we all had to kind of rush online during COVID, there was a lot of hesitation, especially due to those safety and privacy practices that Erin talked about. You know, who owns the chats? Is it VAWA compliant? Is it FIPSA compliant? How would I train my staff? What kind of safety considerations do survivors need to have? How can we help folks delete their text or chat history? So a lot of safety concerns. So we wanted to create some implementation guidance for the field. What we're going to talk about today is from the first phase of our project. I just want to let you all know that we actually recently got funded for a second phase of this project, where we're looking at what some of the outcomes of Hotline are. And Dr. Vostrag is a partner on that project, and we've expanded sites. So we're looking at multiple sites where chat and text services are being offered. So hopefully we'll come back next year to TASA and share some more information about what kind of the outcomes of these services are. So that's just like a little hype for our current study. What we're going to talk about today is how tech-based advocacy, chat and text advocacy, was implemented at SafeLine specifically. And I just want to mention what data we looked at. We looked at 442 chat and text transcripts that were de-identified by Erin herself. So that let us see in real time how the model of service was being implemented. We interviewed staff, not only at SafeLine, but at other hotlines and other agencies in Texas, to understand how the service was being implemented and kind of what some of the needs would be. We also interviewed people that had used chat and text at SafeLine, and people who were kind of the targets of SafeLine chat and text with prospective service users. So folks that were either younger folks, or people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people from different marginalized groups that may benefit from chat and text. And we conducted a survey of folks after their chat and text service interaction. So before we kind of launch into some of the evaluation data, I just wanted you to see in real time how much this service is being used. So Erin just talked about them being on track for, what did you say, Erin? 26,000 contacts?
26,000, and that's a conservative estimate.
Woo! Okay, so the service is being used. So one of the first things we were looking at is, you know, are people using this? Are people, is this happening? Is this something, one of the things that we do as researchers to understand if something might be usable to people is to see if they're using it. And what you see with SafeLine is that people still predominantly use the phone as their primary mechanism of outreach, but that from implementation in 2018 of the full chat and text through this year, there is an increase of folks using chat and text services, a steady increase of chat and text service use. And then especially during the 2019, 2020, that was a little bit of a reduction of phone use, but we definitely see folks using chat and text more and more. That asterisk is there because the text platform is down for a short period of time in the time of the data collection. So that's what that asterisk is for. You can also see that service use in general was up a little bit more in 2018, 2019, and then went down in 2019, 2020, and then went up again. If you remember what happened in March of 2020, that was the COVID pandemic's beginning. So then we saw a big leap in service use again. So we're going to dig into some of that data a little bit. So this is something we showed, even though this is a sexual assault conference, I wanted just to make sure that we showed just kind of like, we looked at some of the temporal trends of folks, because a lot of the DV calls are actually sexual assault calls. So that's the thing, that's a little bit. So we're going to show both the sexual assault and the domestic violence calls. So related to the content of how people were calling, you can see there's some bumps in service use around different times, and then service use decreases. So you can see that bump in August, September, October of 19 was around the time of the Kavanaugh hearings. And then we see a decrease, which is kind of predictable for domestic violence related calls during the winter holiday months. So that's a pretty steady decrease. But then we see calls spike again in the summer of 19 when you're going to have more shelter requests. So domestic violence calls and shelter requests tend to flow seasonally. And then we see a dip in the beginning of the pandemic during the lockdown phase, and then we see a big spike up when the lockdown gets lifted. So this kind of stuff is really interesting. I think one of the reasons we like to show it is because as you start to look at, if you are thinking about implementing chat and text, or maybe you just are doing hotline for your phone hotline, looking at your contacts and the historic trends with your contacts helps to plan with staffing. So if you know you're going to get inundated with a lot of calls, I think one of our clear takeaways here was that when there's a national event like the Kavanaugh hearing or the COVID-19 pandemic, that you can expect that there's going to be an increased call volume or an increased service volume. We also saw some local trends were really important. So you can see some of those increases in 19 and 20 were related to housing changes that happened in the city of Austin, big policy changes. So whenever you have a national or local kind of switch up in how services are provided, or there's kind of a cultural event, you may need to increase your staffing so your existing staff don't get overburdened and exhausted. Erin, do you want to add anything about that?
I don't think so. No, I think you got it.
This is the sexual assault trend line, and you can see, so this is Dr. Ford's testimony and the Kavanaugh hearing. So you can see this very sharp increase there. And you can see it kind of tilting up in the beginning of that Kavanaugh hearing. So again, this just kind of underscores for us the point of national and local events do influence how often folks are chatting, texting, calling in. And that's important from a staffing perspective. We have a little bit of a similar trend line here in that COVID related dip when just people didn't have as much safety to reach out. And then of course, an increase. So you can also, I'm just going to go back for a minute. You can see that the DV trend line does not, it follows vaguely that sexual assault trend line, but they're not the same trend lines. So different things might be motivating some of these calls. And one thing to keep in mind for us looking at this through, if any of the rest of y'all are in college towns, I know it's hard to think about Austin that way, but it is essentially a huge college town. We have 50,000 students here. So some of our trends are associated with times when there might be heightened activity at the university as well. So that's another kind of note for staffing, especially related to sexual assault calls, that it's important to kind of be aware of the university calendar temporal trends. I think we're all doing this out of instinct, but it's fun to see the data that supports those experiences. So I want to talk a little bit about what we learned from looking at those 442 transcripts. And what we saw is that the vast majority of chat and text reach outs are people who identify as a survivor or victim themselves. But we still have about 20%, just over 20% that are other support people, caseworkers from other organizations, school teachers, medical care providers, writing to find out about SANE exam procedures, and then a lot of informal support people. So I have a friend, I have my daughter, I'm concerned about this situation happened to my friend, I'm not sure how to support them. So that's a substantial portion of what we're seeing on chat and text. Chat and text is in particular a low barrier way for those friends and family members to reach out with those kinds of questions. So when you're implementing this service, it's important to keep in mind that some of those reach outs are going to be the caseworker who's at her desk and can't make a phone call, but needs to know how long it would take to get a SANE exam for her client. The bulk of the calls that or the chat and text that we analyze, service interactions that we analyze, just just over half were dating violence, intimate partner violence. I will say that many of these chats and texts have multiple concerns. So they're one of the things that we actually saw the most frequently was sexual assault within the context of an intimate partner violence situation. That's something that's coming up a lot. Adults molested as children. I don't know, Erin, if you want to talk at all, please unmute at any time to talk about this. Because Safeline does work with, and SAFE as a broader organization works with human trafficking survivors, a lot of volume on that, or potential human trafficking, and then sexual assault related calls as well. People express a lot of different needs in these chat and text interactions, and sometimes it's hard to, the main need is just to talk or to connect with somebody. But we do see that for a lot of folks reaching out to Safeline, they might be reaching out for emergency shelter because they are a shelter as well. But that legal advocacy and emotional support, and we have this kind of vague category of relationship advice. So I'll describe what that is. Relationship advice is two things. It's, I'm in this situation in my relationship and it's on the fringe, or it's gray, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Or I got this feedback from my partner about my behaviors, and I'm not quite sure what to do with that. It's also, I have this friend or family member, they're in the situation that's making me uncomfortable, that I'm concerned about, and I'm reaching out for support. So people often, most frequently, have multiple needs when they reach out to Safeline. So they may present with an immediate need related to shelter, or related to counseling, or related to needing to get a SANE exam. But in the course of that chat and text interaction, other needs are emerging that the advocate is going to help provide some support services around. Erin, do you want to say a little bit more about sexual violence related needs for those folks that are chatting in on that specifically?
I'm trying to think of what you didn't cover. I think the big thing was just to keep in mind that it's not only survivors that we are hearing from, but folks within the community that are reaching out not only for resources to support their loved one or the survivor that they're working with, but also to get care for themselves as a loved one. We do hear from a lot of, and we use the term loved one to mean friend, family, partner of a survivor of sexual assault. We do hear from a lot of loved ones who call, and in the chat or text, they are the main client of the situation, because they're needing to talk about the emotions that are coming up for them as a result of the sexual assault that their loved one has experienced, the anger that they're feeling. And so they're needing support navigating through those emotions. And then a lot of times they're also looking for education to make sense of what happened, to try to better understand it. That's a great opportunity for us to dispel some of the myths about sexual assault and why it happens, as well as to connect these loved ones with resources that will be helpful for them to meet their needs so that they can work through that and be the best support person that they can for the survivor.
Yeah, and I'll say that, from a data perspective, this is from our analysis of the chat and text transcripts, but when we also surveyed people after their chat and text, we got very similar results, which was the top needs were counseling, legal advocacy, and housing. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what this is really tells us is how we would prepare advocates, the kind of information that they need to have. These are kind of the greatest hits. So that the Safeline staff have copious documents of things they can copy and paste in the chats and texts for those frequently asked questions. So I think it kind of helps also support, if you were starting chat and text services, what kinds of documents you would want to put together in advance about your local legal advocacy, or common questions about report and non-report for sexual assault. So you have an answer that is then available for an advocate to customize later. we generally find, and this is something we'll be digging into more in our second phase, is that folks who use Safeline feel very positively about it. We see that there's a minority, but like a pretty sizable group that use it multiple times. That the vast majority of people feel like they got some support or a lot of support from Safeline, and that they agree or strongly agree that staff helped help them meet their needs. Where people tend to be a little bit more unsatisfied is when they have a shelter request that isn't able to be met, which in our large urban areas in Texas is a pretty frequent thing to have happen. We just don't have enough shelter beds for all the folks that need it. And I think SAFE actually has some really exciting things on the horizon in that front that I'll let Erin share about later. But generally we find from our interviews and from our work surveying folks is that they really like the service. What we're going to dig into now, and Erin and I are going to have a little bit more of a back and forth, is we're going to talk about, from all of these chat and text transcripts and interviews and surveys and focus groups we created a logic model for Safeline that can be adapted by your organization, whoever you're working with, for your own chat and text services. So these are specific to Safeline in Austin, and Austin is its own unique little conundrum in the middle of the state. But for your own area, local hotlines are really important. And one thing I've learned on this study is that what happens at Safeline supports the work of the national hotline, and it doesn't so much overlap. Like, it's really important to have these chat and text services at the local level as well as at the national level. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit through the logic model, which talks about the skills some of the chat and text service users kind of prefer, but also some of the skills that the advocates are using. And I'm going to go through some things, and Erin's going to chime in as we go through it. So what I want to talk about first is just emphasizing a little bit about, and let me back up for a minute. I think we have some documents that kind of outline this logic model and implementation that are available on the CVP website. We're going to use quotes today that have been de-identified and are taken directly from either transcripts or interviews. So they might not be how Erin or I would say something. Like, we might tend to use the phrase person using violence rather than abuser. But this was how this appeared verbatim. We wanted to keep it authentic to how people presented the information. In general, before we dig into the logic model, I just want to say that from our staff interviews and from our interviews with service users, what we know is that how people approach chat and text advocacy is as a trauma-informed survivors or service user-centered digital space. So basically creating or holding a digital space for survivors to engage in services. So it's kind of creating that global digital platform, extending that kind of reach and promise of social media into that space, and creating a confidential, safe, and private space that is survivor-centered and can be accessed anywhere. One thing that's a very high value at Safeline is to assess survivor needs on their own terms and at their own pace. So these chat and texts are not an intake. They're not an interview. They are really letting the story unfold with the survivor as time goes on. And Erin, can you talk a little bit about how long some of these service interactions take?
Absolutely. So we have found that the text interactions tend to be rather quick, maybe I'd say 30 seconds to 2 minutes or so. A lot of folks who make the decision to use text, for example, just need a quick connection or response from us. So the perfect example would be someone checking in on our waiting list to receive shelter. We ask that folks, if they're safe, check in with us daily. Some folks, when they check in, really like to talk about if their situation and level of danger has changed, any resources that they might need, while others, when they check in, it goes very quickly. Hi, my name is so-and-so. Nothing has changed since we last spoke. I will talk to you again tomorrow. So um, it's really a benefit for folks to be able to choose how they're most comfortable interacting with us, and then based on how much time they need to spend with us, what is most comfortable for them. For example, a shelter intake could take 20-30 minutes or so. That can be really challenging to do over text. And so we can also guide folks about what might be the easiest platform to use based on what their needs are, but ultimately it's up to the client what their preference is.
Yeah, and we heard from some advocates that they might, who are, working chat and text that day, that they might have, maybe 2 different conversations because there might be a lag time between people's ability to respond, but that some advocates really try not to have too many conversations going on at the same time so they can kind of focus on that. Can you talk a little bit about how you all arrange, because you have phone and chat and text, how do you staff that, and what kind of advice do you give for advocates to how many chat and text calls they should be engaged in at the same time, because it can take a while for people to respond?
Absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that when we first started to implement chat and text, we thought that it would be important to have a distinction between advocates who handled hotline calls and advocates that handled chat and text. We learned that, SafeLine is so busy that we would often be asking folks to help us out if one platform was busier than the other platform. And so over time, folks just became trained on how to use all 3 platforms to respond to clients. And generally, we don't have guidelines about how many chats or texts that you should be handling at once. A lot of that depends on the skill and the comfort level of the advocate, but also a lot can depend upon just the volume of contacts that you're getting. In a crisis, I'll admit we have had folks taking hotline calls and doing chats at the same time. Not best practice, but at the same time, that felt like what we needed to do based on the volume coming in. We do know that as advocates become more experienced, they do feel more comfortable maybe navigating a couple chats at the same time. But again, it's based on what the content is. We find that chats and texts tend to also go slower. The pace is slower too. And so there are times when advocates can navigate back and forth pretty easily between chats. Sometimes chatters want to take a few minutes or several minutes in between their responses. And so that allows the advocate to go back and forth.
I'll give an example from one of the interviews we did of somebody who was kind of trapped with their partner using violence in a remote location, and they were texting with their advocate over SafeLine, and they had to delete every text so that their partner wouldn't see it. And so the conversation moved pretty slow because they would read the response from the advocate, then they would delete it, then they would send a text, then they would delete the text that they sent. So, there was, and they said, sometimes I forget what I said before. But people are using this in real time, and the advocate was actually the person who was able to provide the information about how to delete the text. This was somebody who wasn't particularly tech savvy and didn't really know how to do that. So not only are the advocates tending to those other things, they're also tech safety support in terms of folks reaching out. And I thought that was a good example of somebody kind of trying to hold the thread over a chat and text conversation.
Absolutely.
Through our work together, we identified 5 core goals for SafeLine. And again, if you're implementing this in your unique context, like if you're a university, college campus, you may tweak these goals. But what we found the goals of SafeLine are rapid engagement for support and connection. That's that idea of creating that trauma-informed digital space. Or as one person said, being the first open door to support. SafeLine's goals are to identify the needs of service users. And I use the phrase service users because I haven't thought of anything better to describe the broad range of people who are engaging on this platform. One day I'll come up with something better. to identify needs and options related to violence, abuse, and related harm, including racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other kind of patriarchal violence. To expand understanding of violence and abuse and harm through survivor and community education. So the truth of it is, Hotline, whether it's phone, chat, or text, is an extension of our prevention and community education approaches. Not only is it that individual one-on-one, we're chatting about this situation in my life, a lot of what's happening on Hotline is educating people about healthy and unhealthy relationships, about systemic issues that affect survivors. It's really an extension of that community education that we do. It's really important in that way. A goal is to improve survivor safety, to prevent future violence and harm through safety planning, through legal advocacy, through shelter access, and to increase access to timely supports by opening the door to other resources and for our study at SAFE and beyond in the rest of the community. So these are the goals. What you'll see in the implementation guide is we go through each goal and we talk about the skills that accompany those goals. And for today, I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly because I want to get to the practical considerations. Since this is outlined so nicely in our implementation guide, Erin, I think I'm going to kind of scooch through these pretty quick. What we do in the implementation guide that's available is we kind of go through each of these skills and we give an example of it, and talk about how advocates use those skills. One of the things that we get asked about the most is how do you make yourself seem like a real person and not a bot, as the kids would say, over chat and text. And I think by looking at these skills and looking at the examples, you can see some of how that happens and how people show personality and show a sense of self and presence. A lot of what you're going to see here, if you've been working in this movement for a long time, are really standard advocacy skills. What happens on chat and text is a different modality, but it's not that different from phone. It's not that different from in person. We're still identifying strengths. We're using empathy. We're establishing boundaries. We're working on safety. All of those things are still happening. So I think that a lot of what we're seeing in kind of those early parts of the service interactions is people assessing what people's needs and goals are for that interaction. And sometimes it's just, I had a nightmare in the middle of the night about something that happened to me as a kid. I just need someone. And sometimes it's, I experienced a sexual assault at this party and I need a forensic exam and I need to know what a forensic exam is. I'm not sure what that is. So a lot of that work is kind of not only to kind of collaboratively assess what those needs are, but to identify options that are going to work for that person. And the advocate really needs to be ready for the feedback that those options aren't ideal. And one of the ways that SafeLine advocates have really prepared for this is by creating different mechanisms to address safety concerns that don't involve working with law enforcement if that person is not comfortable with that. For goal 3, which is really that understanding of violence, abuse, and harm, and is really not only psychoeducation, kind of like DV 101, SA 101, identifying healthy and unhealthy relationships, talking about consent, especially for the younger service users, see a lot of interactions where people are talking about consent and how to identify if a situation was consensual and was it consensual for them. But also education on people's rights, especially related to violence and harm. And one of the things that comes up a lot on these interactions is the identification of wellness and grounding strategies, especially for people managing complex trauma reactions. And these are things that are like breathing exercises, butterfly hugs, orienting kind of grounding activities that staff are going to use in different situations to help people kind of calm down their nervous systems and then be able to either get some sleep or kind of go on to their next resource. And Erin, feel free to kind of chime in at any point. I'm going to go through this, but unmute and add it as I go.
Sure. I do want to say, in terms of the techniques that you were just describing to help folks regulate themselves, our advocates also use those very same techniques and skills in between contacts as a way to take care of themselves and help ground themselves and come back to a neutral place where they are ready and available to serve the next client.
Yeah, that's great. I love one thing I've noticed about y'all as a staff is that conversation of wellness and just kind of the weight of hotline work is something that's happening every day, and really acknowledged, really working on building a culture where that's okay to talk about. We don't kind of have to be basses all the time. So I think that's really important.
And let me say that is a relatively new thing for us to be doing on Safeline. And I would like to give credit to our Safeline director, Rachel Caballero, who really brought those skills and ideas with her when she became our Safeline director, and really allowed us to shift our focus to advocate wellness, advocate retention, and making sure advocates have their educational and professional needs met to be able to grow within the agency, or grow out in the world. So just shout out to Rachel. She's a big part of why we are where we are now.
I think that's so important too, because from a not only is it important from a standpoint of like protecting and honoring our workforce, it's also an important point of quality control for clients and the quality of advocacy services that they get when people get that support. And I think that that's a kind of really central thing. If you're going to implement chat and text, you're going to increase your service contacts, which means that you're going to need to either support that workforce in increasing their workload and thus their wellness, so you can retain them and maybe even take on new workforce for that reason. So for goal 4, really focused on safety and safety planning. So not surprisingly, a lot of what's happening on chat and text is around safety planning. And for sexual violence, that might be addressing an ongoing situation with, especially for younger folks with sexual violence in the home, maybe from or a sibling or somebody else that's living in that home. And a lot of the interactions with folks kind of dealt with that particular issue, or with human trafficking related things, kind of forced sexual contact issues, and really getting creative about safety and safety assessments. So, the Safeline advocates really have used a lot of that safety beyond leaving harm reduction model of safety planning and assessing for safety work. And I think that's really important frame. So rather than promoting this kind of report to the police, leave the situation, those options are being offered, but there's also alternative options being offered. And part of what the impact of that is that folks feel like they can reach out again, because when people are given, this is what we heard in the interviews a lot, when people are given a range of options related to their safety that aren't just hinging on leaving the situation or doing a formal report to police or a SANE exam, they feel like the judgment is reduced, and they feel like they're able to reach out again for more support. And in most situations with services, we like to, kind of be like, oh, one and done. If they don't come back, that means things worked good. On Hotline, one of the key indicators we look at for service success is, did folks reach out again? Because that we know that we can't address all survivors' needs at once. Some folks, yes, it's great. We can address that need one time and it's good. But if you're thinking about implementing this, or even for your own phone services, looking at repeat calls is really an important indicator that tells us that folks feel safe to reach out again, that the service has a use to them, that they're able to engage safely in that service. So that's an important data indicator. We also see that just Safeline chat and text services are really connect people with other supports and services. They're helping people not only assess their needs, but then identify informal supports that they could reach out to or formal supports that they could reach out to. And one of the, really important components to that, especially when working with younger folks, like adolescents and emerging adults, is they're helping people, they're providing kind of what we call help seeking assistance or coaching in how to reach out. Like if you had a sexual assault, while you were at UT Austin, and you're going to reach out to their sexual assault services, and you've never done anything like that before. How do I call and ask for counseling? What's that going to be like? So there's a lot of kind of guidance about that.
I would like to say that coaching folks around how to access resources can be a big part of what we do. Like you said, we often hear from folks who don't know what to say or what to ask for. And so we will invite them to practice what they want to say before they reach out to a resource. We encourage them and we work with them to make lists of everything that they want to talk with someone about when they reach out. So we try to go beyond just providing names and numbers of resources that might be helpful. We try to take it a few steps further and just say, are there any barriers that you might have to reaching out to these resources, whether it's regarding the hours of operations, language access, in anything like that. We try to eliminate those barriers and even go as far as to ask folks if they would allow us to do a warm transfer, if that would make them feel more comfortable reaching out, or if they don't want to do a warm transfer, can we call the resource ahead of time and say, please expect a call from so-and-so. So we do what we can, not only to connect folks with the appropriate resources, but to make sure that they feel comfortable and safe to utilize those resources and move forward.
And, from a point of looking at, analyzing the transcripts, that's happening a lot. So part of what I also see is that, folks, you all work really intentionally having that people can copy and paste and customize. So if you're thinking about starting this service, it's starting to generate some of that content, and then advocates can custom it to certain situations, really helps with that advocate workload. So you're not kind of like retyping, here's what counseling might look like, and here's how you would ask about it, and here are the, because part of what we see too is advocates anticipate potential barriers and then help kind of guard against them. Like, if your doctor should be dismissive of you about this side effect related to your sexual assault experience, here are 3 things you can say. There's a lot of kind of self-advocacy guidance as well that's, I think, really important. We have additional information in the implementation guide about some of the core skills that are used specifically on chat and text. And I just want to emphasize, just for the sake of time today, one of the most important ones, which is a, kind of meta communication about content and tone and response. So one of the biggest kerfluffles, funny things that happens, if you probably had this happen, anybody here has had this happen when you text a friend, and because the text is kind of flat, it doesn't show emotion, unless you put certain punctuation or emojis or whatever, people read it the wrong way, not as you would intend it. So a lot of what happens over chat and text that's different than phone, where you can hear somebody's voice, you can hear if they're crying, you can hear voice rise and fall, you can hear if they're cheerful or if they're mad. A lot of what happens is clarification about what people meant about certain things, like, I'm sorry for assuming that, or when I said this is what I meant, or I should have sent a smiley face with it, or so a lot of clarification about tone. In that way, I just want to say that some advocates really show their personality with some style and flair points, which is, we used to say, never use emojis, never use punctuation that's, I know women in general get dinged for using too many nails. So I don't know, you try being nice all the time. So we see a lot of advocates will show their personality, not only by maybe sharing a little tidbit like, oh, I like to cuddle with my cat when I'm sad too, but also by, using a frowny face or a heart, using different, if just to show somebody that they're listening instead of being able to verbally say, they'll type, I'm listening, so folks know. So there's a lot of different ways that people show their personality. And what we find is the more that people show a personality, it doesn't have to be the unicorn emoji personality. It can be the, I'm listening, I got you, I'm here personality, that they feel like there's a real person, an authentic person on the other end of that phone or the other end of that chat and text. What we find,
Really quick, Layla. Sorry, this is Amelia. I just wanted to ask you if you could to please slow down. Our interpreters are having a bit of an issue keeping up with the pace at which you're speaking.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you so much.
So what I'm trying to make sure we get through our slides, but I'll just prioritize. I think we can share these slides. Is that correct?
Yes, these
So we
slides
got-
will be shared.
Start. I'm trying to, yeah, okay, great. What I want to make sure that we get to, because of times, I want to talk about some of the sexual assault specific skills and that we would use on Safeline. So I'm going to go to those and we'll go back. But Erin, if you don't mind, I'm just going to kind of pivot over to those.
Okay, is that me? Okay, let's see. So here are some best practices and considerations that are especially helpful for new advocates. We encourage folks to use the platform. It's helpful to practice with other advocates when you first get started to ensure that you know how to identify when a chat is coming in, how to prioritize and manage multiple chats at the same time. What Dr. Wood alluded to earlier, flawless typing isn't essential, but being ready to respond quickly and clearly is very important. Know where to access resources to offer when needed. On Safeline, we have a live document of resources where all staff can make additions or changes as needed, so we can have the most up-to-date information. We've talked about use of canned responses, which are pre-written responses to common questions or resources that are available for you to cut and paste into chat or text. For example, all of the rape crisis centers available in Central Texas. That's quite a list. And so to have all of that already typed out so you can just cut and paste it into your chat or text really saves a lot of time and energy for the advocate. And it's important to let folks know that if they want to do a shelter intake by text or chat, that it can be very lengthy to use chat and text because they might just prefer to call the hotline. Chat and text tend to take 2 to 3 times as long as it does in a regular hotline call. And so that would just be a longer process. I have more if we've got time, if I could keep going.
Yes, and we have these ones for sexual assault specific too.
Okay, let me look for those in my notes real fast. Okay, so specific to sexual assault, I think it's important for advocates to be clear about mandatory reporting for youth and vulnerable adults. Early and clear communication about our reporting requirements is important, even as early as the beginning of the chat or text, if it's appropriate. If that's not possible, be sure to share reporting requirements to CPS or APS as soon as the client begins to disclose something that may be reportable. You don't want to wait until after they share something that is reportable to then let them know what you have to do with that information. Also, to make sure that we are as transparent as possible, we share on the Safeline welcome message of our chat that we're mandated reporters, so hopefully clients won't ever feel caught off guard.
I'll take that second bullet point. So if you're in a university town or even with high school, middle schoolers, one thing that folks might have questions about related to chat and text if they're on a college campus is Title IX reporting considerations. And if that's not something your staff is particularly fluid in, then connecting with an advocate or a university representative to understand those criteria is really important. We have some guidance as well on our website. Texas specifically has a law that mandates Title IX reporting in some situations. So we have a unique law and consideration for that. So getting additional information about, I think this comes up the most folks who are thinking about reporting to their university, information about those Title IX regulations. The other thing I would say is Title IX is about to be changed again. So it gets changed, by administration. So keeping up to date with that. I know that the advocates on SafeLine have mentioned in the past using the website, Know Your Title IX, but also just having a connection with your university to understand what the reporting requirements will look like if they reach out. Most universities have confidential advocacy services, so folks will have a place that they can reach out, but if they just Google sexual assault UT Austin, they might get the Title IX office instead of the confidential advocacy. So, really being prepared to offer those referrals for sexual assault, I think are really important.
Some additional considerations would be that for dating violence and human trafficking contacts, those should include sexual assault assessment for medical and legal needs. A survivor may state that they've experienced dating violence or trafficking without explicitly saying that they've experienced sexual assault. So it's important for us as advocates to ask if sexual assault is something that they've experienced so that they are aware of their medical and reporting options that may be really time sensitive. Another important thing that I'd like to mention is to encourage advocates to trust your gut about sexual assault related calls that may feel a little off or that may veer off target, as a lot of those eventually turn into what we refer to as just sexual gratification calls. Our experience on SafeLine has been that most survivors don't want to share graphic details of their sexual assault with advocates, although some may choose to do so. But when someone says something like, can I tell you a secret, or can I provide you with the details of my sexual assault so you can tell me if a sexual assault happened? Just be mindful of boundaries and consider stating that you really don't need those graphic or intimate details of the sexual assault to provide emotional support and connection to resources. Redirect if the client continues to veer off target, and even eventually consider ending the contact if the client repeatedly provides details that just aren't needed. I think we mentioned earlier that a lot of sexual assault related calls may be loved ones calling needing support for themselves or the survivors in their lives. So just make sure that folks know how to offer that to loved ones that are in need. I think it's important to note the importance and value of creating space for the unique needs and considerations of people of color and LGBTQ survivors. We know that survivors in the LGBTQIA+ community may face additional challenges in accessing legal, medical, law enforcement, or other resources. They may feel especially alone because of some societal beliefs, maybe that sexual assault doesn't or can't happen to LGBTQ individuals, and that can really make it harder for them to feel believed. Survivors in the LGBTQ community may not always find support in some faith communities. And telling someone of your sexual assault may be made harder if you are not out. Likewise, I just want to mention that there's significant historical trauma in the lives of survivors of color who are also more likely to suffer multiple traumas and adverse economic and health issues than non-persons of color. Persons of color often face numerous barriers to accessing resources that prevent or discourage them from reporting sexual violence or receiving supportive services. These barriers can include language access, lack of diversity among services staff, transportation difficulties, and lack of service structures that honor their cultural identities, needs, beliefs, and styles of expression. So it's essential as advocates that we educate ourselves about these and any other special considerations so that we can approach all survivors with cultural humility, so that we can have a curiosity and an open ear about the way that we can best support and strive to become partners in affecting social change.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that we have time for questions. I'm gonna just invite people to either chat questions or come off mute and ask questions, just because I feel like we can share the rest of our slides. But if you have like a burning question you want to ask while Erin's here, I'm gonna just stop the share for a minute and I'm gonna put our emails in the chat and see if anybody has any questions.
Erin, Layla, and Rachel, I just want to make sure that you all are in a channel that's appropriate in case somebody comes off mute and asks a question in Spanish, so that you can hear interpretation in English. Just want to make sure.
Okay. I see that Rachel put the implementation guide in the chat, so that information is there. I think we can share these slides, is that right?
Yes, and I'll be putting a link to the materials. There's technically not, the materials will be made available until after the entire conference. But the link that you all provided is great. So if you all would like to have, if attendees, you would like to have access to these slides right away, you can go ahead and click on the link that they provided.
Okay, that is for our implementation guide, but if you want these, so what we didn't get to today is information about staff training, which I think is important, and that's in those slides. It's also in the guide. And I'll make sure I get Erin. Erin, do you put your email in the chat?
There you go.
Awesome. So if folks want the rest of the slides today, we would be happy to, I can email a copy of those to whoever. And if you have questions about just your specific program or anything else, we've got, we're continuing this work. So especially just with some of the state policy changes, the role of the advocates, chat and text, and meeting the needs of survivors will change within those kind of contexts. So we're going to be working on this in real time. And Erin is a phenomenal resource if you're thinking about implementing these services. And we're going to continue to try to build the evidence base and get that data out through TASA, through TCFD, through NNEDB,